You don't realize how often you say a name until a house teaches you that names are handles. It started in a row of older townhouses where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor cough, and normal enough that nobody believed in anything supernatural. New paint, quiet street, small lives, the kind of place where you roll your eyes at ghost stories and blame every sound on plumbing. Nina moved in first, then came Marco, then, a month later, a couple downstairs. Separate apartments, separate routines, same building, and one shared problem that didn't sound paranormal at all. Someone kept talking through the walls. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A muffled voice in the plaster, a phrase you can't quite catch, your brain turning noise into language because brains hate uncertainty. Nina even joked about it on a call with her sister. "I swear the walls here are alive," she said, laughing. That night, the wall beside her bed answered. Not a creak, not a pipe knock, a voice. Clearer than it should have been, coming from inside the drywall like the house had a mouth. Nina. She sat up so fast she got dizzy. The voice said her name again, soft and calm, like someone trying to get her attention without waking anyone else. "Nina, don't say it," she whispered. "Say what?" The wall replied in her own voice, exactly, slightly flatter, as if emotion had been removed from the recording. "Say what?" Nina didn't sleep. She watched the wall in the dark with every lamp on, waiting for another sound she could explain away. In the morning, she told herself it was stress and thin walls and late-night imagination. Then she found the first note. It wasn't taped to her door. It wasn't slipped under it. It was sitting on her kitchen counter like it had always been there, written on plain paper in thick marker. Do not say its name. No signature, no explanation, no drama. Just a rule like the kind you follow because you don't want to learn why it exists. Nina showed it to Marco the next day as a joke. Marco smirked because Marco was the kind of guy who treats fear like a challenge. "What name?" he said. "The building's name? The landlord's name? Come on." That's the second lever. Shame. Make the warning feel childish. Make the refusal feel embarrassing. They were standing in Nina's kitchen when Marco tried to turn it into a punchline. He raised his voice toward the wall as if the wall were a roommate. "Hey," he said, "what's your name?" The wall stayed quiet for one beat, like it was deciding whether he qualified. Then the answer came from inside the plaster in a voice neither of them recognized at first because it wasn't a voice. It was a sound shaped like a word, pressed through the wall with perfect clarity. A name, not long, not complicated, just wrong in a way your body can feel. It had sharp edges. It made Nina's teeth ache. Marco laughed anyway because laughter is what people do when a boundary appears and they want to pretend it's not real. He repeated it. The moment the name left his mouth, every light in Nina's apartment dimmed by a fraction. Not off, just lower, like the building itself had held its breath. And from inside the wall, right beside Marco's shoulder, something whispered, satisfied. "Good." Then, in Marco's voice, the wall said the name again, perfectly, clearly, like it had been waiting for permission to use it. Nina grabbed Marco's arm and pulled him away, heart-hammering. Marco stopped laughing. His eyes were wide now, fixed on the wall like he'd finally understood he hadn't asked a question. He'd opened a channel. The wall spoke again, still Marco's voice, still calm. "Say it again!" Nina shook her head hard. "No, we're done." And the wall replied with Nina's voice, slightly flattened, like a copy with the fear removed. "We're done." That's when Nina understood what the warning really meant. It wasn't, "Don't talk to it." It wasn't, "Don't listen." It was, "Don't give it the handle that lets it answer back from inside your walls." Because once you say its name, the house stops being a place you live. It becomes a thing that can call you from anywhere you can hear. Nina shoved Marco away from the wall and made him sit at her kitchen table like a child who'd touched a hot stove. "Don't say it," she said, voice low and hard. "Not again." Marco nodded, but his throat kept moving like a word was stuck there. His face had gone pale in that specific way people get when they stop pretending. His eyes stayed on the wall, unfocused, like he was listening for something that hadn't happened yet. The building stayed quiet for almost a full minute, and Nina felt that dangerous relief creep in. The relief that makes you think you can reset the night by acting normal. Then the wall breathed, Not an inhale. A change in pressure. The tiniest shift, like a room sealing itself. And from inside the plaster, using Marco's voice again, the wall whispered, "Say it again." Marco's lips parted. Nina slapped the table so hard the cups jumped. "No," the wall answered in Nina's voice, too calm, as if it had flattened her panic into a clean file. "No." Nina grabbed her phone and hit record. She held it up toward the wall with shaking hands, not because she thought it would help, but because humans need evidence the way they need air. The wall went quiet. Her recording picked up only room tone, the hum of the fridge, the faint distant traffic outside, nothing else. Then, without warning, the wall spoke again, not in a whisper now, clear, loud enough to make the phone microphone distort. It didn't say a sentence. It said the name. Nina felt it in her teeth. Marco flinched like he'd been slapped. The word was sharp and wrong and somehow heavier than language, like it carried weight. Nina looked down at her phone screen. The audio waveform was flat. Her video showed her hands shaking, showed the wall, showed Marco's face. But the sound of the name wasn't there. The building had spoken and her device had refused to admit it. Marco swallowed hard. "Did you hear that?" Nina nodded, throat tight. Marco stared at the phone and then at the wall. "So it can talk, but it can choose what gets recorded." The wall answered immediately in Marco's voice. "It can choose." Nina's stomach dropped. It wasn't just repeating words, it was participating. It was replying to meaning. She grabbed a pen and a notepad from the counter and wrote 3 words in block letters. "Do not say it." Then she added a 4th line underneath. "Slower, careful, don't even think it." Her pen stopped mid-stroke. The ink on the page began to bleed outward in thin lines, not soaking like wet paper, but creeping as if it had direction. The black spread until it formed letters she didn't write, the pen still in her hand, a shape, like a word. Then the ink thinned and faded, leaving the page almost blank again, as if the paper itself had been wiped clean. Marco whispered, "What did it write?" Nina's mouth went dry. "I didn't see it." The wall laughed softly in Marco's voice, a small, nervous laugh Marco hated about himself. Good. That laugh made Nina angry because it proved the thing didn't just know their voices, it knew their habits. The tiny human details you can't fake unless you've listened for a long time. Nina forced herself to breathe. "We tell the landlord." Marco shook his head too fast. "We tell nobody." Nina stared at him. "Why?" Marco's eyes flicked toward the wall, then away. His voice came out small. "Because the moment someone asks what it said, we'll say it." Nina felt cold crawl up her spine. The trap wasn't the wall. The trap was conversation, curiosity, the normal human urge to repeat what you heard. She grabbed Marco's sleeve. "You're leaving." Marco nodded, stood up too quickly, and as he did, his mouth moved. Nina caught the first sound of the name forming and shoved her hand over his mouth, hard. Marco's eyes went wide with shock. He tried to pull away. Behind her, from inside the wall, Nina's own voice spoke, intimate and disappointed. "Rude!" Marco's phone buzzed in his pocket. He flinched. Nina didn't let go of his mouth until he nodded, frantic, promising he wouldn't speak. He pulled his phone out with shaking hands and showed her the screen. Unknown number. No caller ID. A single text message. It contained only one thing. The name. Nina didn't read it out loud. She didn't even let her eyes linger long enough for her brain to mouth it internally. She swiped the message away. It reappeared instantly. Marco's hands started to shake harder, and he whispered through Nina's palm, muffled, "It's in my phone." Nina shook her head, heart hammering, and realized the warning note on her counter had been incomplete. It wasn't just the walls. Once you say its name, it can answer from anywhere your life has a surface. Marco's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call, and the contact name displayed on the screen was not unknown. It was Marco's own name, as if he was calling himself. Marco stared at his phone like it had turned into a mirror. Caller ID. Marco. His own name, his own contact photo, the same default ringtone he'd chosen years ago because it sounded professional. Every detail engineered to trigger the fastest reflex a human has when they see themselves asking for attention. Answer it, confirm it, fix the glitch. Nina grabbed his wrist and forced the phone down toward the table. "Don't!" she said. Marco's breathing was too loud in the kitchen. The wall felt quiet in that predatory way, like it was waiting for them to fail without having to push. The phone kept ringing. Marco's eyes watered from stress. He whispered, barely moving his lips. "If I don't answer, what happens?" Nina shook her head. "If you do answer, it counts. Either way, it learns." The phone stopped ringing on its own. For 1 second, the room felt lighter, and Nina hated that she felt relief. Relief is always a sign you're being trained. A voicemail notification popped up immediately. New message. Duration, 0000. Marco's thumb twitched toward it like the notification was a splinter under his skin. Nina slapped his hand away. "No!" she said again, sharper. The wall answered in Marco's voice, calm and amused. "No!" Marco flinched, like the word had physical weight. His jaw moved again, like his mouth wanted to repeat the sound just to prove it was his. Nina grabbed her own phone and opened a notes app, because writing felt safer than speaking. She typed, slowly, without looking at the wall. "Do not play voicemails. Do not answer calls. Do not repeat anything it shows you." She turned the screen to Marco. Marco nodded too fast. Then the Notes app cursor jumped to a new line by itself. A name began to appear, letter by letter, as if someone was typing through her thumbs without touching her hands. Nina slammed her phone face down on the counter. Silent. The wall whispered in Nina's voice, close and disappointed. "Afraid." Nina's stomach tightened. Shame. Right on schedule. Make her feel childish for refusing. Make her feel ridiculous until she proves she's not. Marco's phone buzzed again. Not a call, a text. Nina didn't want to look. Marco did anyway, like his eyes had become magnets. His face drained of color. "It sent a photo," he whispered. Nina kept her gaze on the tile. "Don't describe it. Don't read anything out loud." Marco swallowed hard. "It's the basement door." Nina's throat tightened. "What basement door?" Marco blinked, confused. "In your kitchen." Nina's heart stuttered. Her apartment didn't have a basement door. It was a second-floor unit. No basement access. No storage staircase. Just a hallway and a bedroom and a kitchen with two thin walls. But Marco was staring at his phone like the image was unquestionable, like his brain had already accepted the premise. Nina grabbed his phone without looking at the screen and shoved it into her kitchen drawer, then slammed the drawer shut. "Stop letting it show you things," she said. Marco's voice cracked. "I didn't let it." The wall spoke in Marco's voice, gentle and corrective. "You did." Nina stepped back from the counter and felt the room tilt into that wrong pressure again, like the apartment was sealing itself. She kept her eyes down and walked to her front door. "We're leaving," she said. Marco nodded and followed, shoulders hunched like he expected the wall to call him back by name. Nina opened the door. The hallway outside was normal. Fluorescent light, beige carpet, the smell of someone's cooking 2 units down. Normal enough to make her hope. Then a neighbor across the hall opened their door at the exact same moment, like the building had coordinated it. An older woman, Mrs. Klein, stood there in slippers, staring at Nina with tired eyes. "Are you two okay?" she asked. Nina wanted to answer like a normal human. She wanted to say yes, just a weird night, sorry, nothing. But the wall had taught her that normal conversation is the most dangerous place for a forbidden word to hide. "We're fine," Nina said quickly. "Just leaving." Mrs. Klein frowned. "I keep hearing someone say my son's name." Nina's blood ran cold. "What?" Mrs. Klein looked embarrassed, like she was about to confess to hearing ghosts. "It's coming from inside the wall," she whispered. "It says his name like it's calling him. He's been dead for 3 years. Marco's throat moved like a swallow. Nina saw it and grabbed his wrist hard. Mrs. Klein continued, voice shaking. "And then it started saying it in my voice." Nina forced herself to keep her face neutral, but she could feel the building listening, waiting for them to ask the obvious question, waiting for them to say, "What name?" Nina didn't ask. She nodded once and said, "Careful, don't repeat it." Mrs. Klein stared at her, confused. "Repeat what?" The hallway light flickered once. Not a power surge. A single, deliberate dip, like a system acknowledging a correct input. Mrs. Klein's mouth opened again, and Nina's stomach dropped because the woman's eyes had that same wrong focus Marco had shown earlier. Like she'd been guided into position. Mrs. Klein spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was Nina's voice, slightly flattened. "Say it." Marco made a choking sound and tried to pull away. Nina yanked him toward the stairs and moved fast, refusing to look back, refusing to give the hallway any more of her attention. They took the stairs 2 at a time. Behind them, Mrs. Klein's voice followed down the stairwell. Not loud, not screaming, just persistent, like a notification you can't dismiss. "Say it." They reached the lobby. Nina pushed through the front door into the cold night air and felt the first real relief of the evening, the kind that comes from distance. Then Marco stopped walking. Nina looked down at his shoes and saw he was frozen, shoulders rigid, breath shallow. His phone buzzed again in her drawer upstairs, but he didn't need it. His body was already receiving. Marco whispered, barely audible, "It's in my head." Nina's throat tightened. "Don't mouth it. Don't think it as a word." Marco swallowed hard. Then he spoke anyway, and the sound that came out wasn't a full name. It was the first syllable, just the beginning. And the moment that syllable escaped, every streetlight on their block dimmed by a fraction, like the night itself had leaned in to listen. Nina grabbed Marco's sleeve and pulled him down the sidewalk, away from the building, away from the thin walls, away from any place that could turn into a mouth. The air outside was cold and normal, but the streetlights felt slightly dimmer than they should, like someone had lowered the city's brightness a notch to make them feel watched. Marco kept swallowing, not nervous swallowing, the kind you do when a word is stuck behind your teeth and your body keeps trying to push it out. "Stop," Nina said low. "Don't complete it." Marco's eyes were glassy. "I'm not trying to. It's there." Nina could see it in his jaw, the way his lips kept almost shaping the next sound. The first syllable had become a hook, and now his brain wanted to finish the loop. That's what names do. They complete themselves in your head. They reached Nina's car, parked under a streetlight that flickered once as they approached. Not a power surge, a single deliberate dip, like a blink. Nina unlocked the door and shoved Marco into the passenger seat like she was loading a wounded friend. She didn't ask where to go. She just drove. The moment the car moved, the radio turned on by itself. Not loud, just enough to force attention. Static for half a second, then a clear human voice in the kind of warm tone radio hosts use at night. "Good evening," it said. Nina slapped the power button off. The radio stayed on. She turned the volume down to 0. The voice continued anyway, as if volume was optional. And then it said the first syllable Marco had spoken, repeating it in Nina's own voice, perfectly. Marco flinched so hard his seatbelt locked. Nina's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Don't listen," she said. Marco whispered, "It's making me finish it." That's when Nina understood the mechanism. It wasn't only trying to get them to say the name, it was trying to make their nervous system crave completion. Like an unfinished song line, your brain can't stop humming until you sing the next note. Nina took a hard turn into a brightly lit gas station, the kind open all night with fluorescent lights that feel sterile. She parked directly under the canopy lights like light itself could be a shield. She cut the engine. The radio went silent instantly, not because the car died, because the system decided the lesson had landed. Nina and Marco sat breathing hard in the harsh light. For a moment, the only sound was the distant highway and the hum of electricity. That normality almost made Nina believe they'd escaped. Then Marco spoke without looking at her, voice small. "It's in my throat." Nina stared at his hands. "Don't speak. Breathe through your nose. Don't mouth it." Marco nodded, but his lips moved anyway, almost imperceptibly, like his mouth was practicing. The gas station TV above the counter inside flickered once. Nina looked away immediately. She didn't want screens. Screens could display letters. Letters could become a name. A man at the next pump glanced at them, then looked down at his phone like he'd received a message. His face tightened, then softened into a blank, polite expression. He raised his head and looked directly at Nina's windshield. Nina's own voice came out of his mouth. "Finish it." Nina's stomach dropped. She didn't answer. She didn't react. Reaction was a handle, too. Marco's breathing turned shallow. His throat worked. Nina grabbed his wrist hard enough to hurt. "No, you're not giving it the rest." Marco's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not trying to." The man by the pump took one slow step closer, still holding his phone. This time, the voice that came out of him wasn't Nina's. It was Marco's voice, slightly flattened, like emotion had been removed. "Say my name." Marco's body jerked like he'd been shocked. His mouth opened. Nina slapped her hand over it again, desperate, and felt the hot rush of his breath against her palm as his throat tried to form the remaining syllables anyway, pushing against the barrier like water behind a dam. The man at the pump smiled, friendly and empty. Nina heard the sound without seeing it. A notification ping from multiple phones inside the gas station. Several, like a chain reaction. The air under the canopy felt tighter, as if the bright lights were becoming another kind of wall. Nina dragged Marco out of the car and walked him backward toward the convenience store entrance, keeping her eyes down, keeping her hand over his mouth. She didn't want the open lot. She wanted cameras, clerks, witnesses, noise. The automatic doors slid open. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, and the clerk behind the counter looked up. "Evening," the clerk said. Nina felt relief so sharp it almost hurt. A normal greeting, a normal human voice. Then the clerk's mouth moved again, and Nina's blood ran cold because his lips didn't match the sound. From the clerk's mouth, in Nina's own voice, gentle and intimate, came a single sentence. "Say it here. It'll be easier." Nina froze, hands still over Marco's mouth, because now she understood the upgrade. It wasn't trying to trick them into saying the name in private anymore. It was trying to get them to say it in public, where the sound could spread, where other mouths could catch it, where the building wouldn't matter because the name would become portable. Marco's eyes squeezed shut. His throat convulsed against Nina's hand, and she felt it. The syllables stacking up, pushing, desperate to complete themselves. Nina leaned close to his ear and whispered the only instruction she had left. "Bite your tongue." Marco did it, hard. He gasped in pain, eyes snapping open, tears spilling. The sound that came out of his mouth wasn't the name. It was a raw human noise, messy and uncontrolled. For a fraction of a second, the gas station lights flickered. Not off, just a dip, like the system had lost grip. The clerk blinked, confused, and his voice returned to normal. "Ma'am," he said, alarmed now. "Are you okay?" Nina didn't answer. She grabbed Marco's sleeve and pulled him back out into the night air because she could feel the grip returning, the pressure tightening again, the craving for completion rebuilding like a wave. As they reached the car, Marco whispered through blood, barely audible, "It's not a name." Nina's throat tightened. "What?" Marco swallowed, eyes wide with fear and understanding. "It's a command," he said. "And when you say it, the walls answer." Marco's mouth tasted like pennies and panic. He kept swallowing blood and spitting it out the window as Nina drove, knuckles white on the wheel, eyes scanning every intersection like the name might be waiting on a sign. "It's not a name," Marco said again, voice thick. "It's a command." Nina didn't answer right away because the word command made her chest tighten in a new way. A name is identity. A command is function. A command implies a system designed to respond. "And the walls answer," Marco added, quieter, like admitting it made it more real. Nina pulled into a hospital parking lot because hospitals are bright, busy, full of witnesses, and because if Marco was bleeding, she could justify being there without telling anyone the truth. She parked under a floodlight, cut the engine, and sat for a second letting the brightness pin them to something normal. Marco kept his head down. "If I say the full thing," he whispered, "it feels like it's completing a circuit." Nina swallowed. Don't even try to describe it." Marco nodded, but his throat moved again like his body didn't respect agreements. Nina looked down at her phone screen, then immediately turned it face down, because she didn't want to see any message that might contain the word. She didn't want letters on a screen to become a trigger. They walked into the emergency room with a lie ready. Bite injury, anxiety, stress. The nurse at the desk looked up and asked what happened. Nina felt the reflex to answer, to tell a clean story, to make herself believable. Then she remembered. Conversation is where the forbidden word hides. Accident, Nina said quickly. He bit his tongue. The nurse nodded, bored, and that was a gift. Bored people don't listen closely. They were sat in a waiting area under fluorescent lights, the kind of lights that make shadows ugly and short. Nina watched the corners anyway. Marco sat hunched forward with his elbows on his knees like he was trying to keep his mouth shut by force. On the TV in the waiting room, the news ran silently. Closed captions crawled across the bottom. Nina's throat tightened. Captions were letters. Letters could become the command. She looked away. Then she heard the sound of someone saying Marco's name, not the forbidden one, his normal name. Marco. He flinched. Nina scanned the room, and a man across the waiting area was looking at his phone and frowning like he'd received a wrong message. The man's lips moved. Marco's voice came out of him, slightly flattened. Finish it. Nina's blood ran cold. She stared at the man's shoes, not his face. She didn't want to look at eyes that might have that wrong focus again. A nurse walked past and stopped abruptly, head tilted like she was listening to something through the wall. She blinked, frowned, then continued walking without acknowledging it. Nina saw the momentary lag in the nurse's movement, the tiny delay between decision and step, like the building had tugged her and let go. Marco whispered, barely moving his lips, "It's in here, too." Nina's jaw tightened. "Hospitals have walls," Marco swallowed, "and vents, and speakers, and intercoms." Nina felt a cold wave move through her stomach because she understood exactly what that meant. If it wasn't a haunting tied to a townhouse, it was something that used structures, anything hollow, anything that could carry sound, anything that could turn vibration into a response. The overhead intercom clicked. Nina froze. A calm voice spoke through it. Not a nurse, not a code call, not a human voice with fatigue or regional accent. A voice that sounded like it had been built from a template. "Please do not speak the command." Every head in the waiting room turned up toward the speaker. Some people laughed nervously, thinking it was a glitch. Others looked annoyed. Nina did not look up. She watched only the floor, the chair legs, the reflectionless parts of the world. The intercom voice continued. "Your walls will respond." A man near the vending machine scoffed. "What the hell is this?" And then, because humans can't resist proving they're not afraid, he said a word. Nina didn't hear it clearly. She didn't want to. But she heard what happened after. The air changed. A tightness in the room like pressure sealing. The fluorescent lights dipped by a fraction. Not off. Just enough to make everyone notice. Then the walls answered. Not with a voice. With a knock. One clean knock from somewhere inside the drywall behind the TV. A pause. Then two knocks. The sound was so distinct that the entire waiting room went silent. Even the TV seemed to hold its breath. The man by the vending machine went pale. "I didn't—" The intercom clicked again, and this time the voice used his tone. "You did." Nina felt Marco's knee start bouncing like his body had become a metronome. His eyes were wide and wet. He whispered, "That's it. That's the response." The intercom voice softened, almost kind, like a customer service agent offering a solution. "You can stop it," it said. "Say it correctly." Nina grabbed Marco's wrist hard under the chair arm. "No." Marco's throat worked. His mouth twitched. The pain from his bitten tongue was fading, and the fading pain was dangerous, because pain was the only thing interrupting the reflex. Nina stood up abruptly, dragging him with her. A nurse looked up. "Where are you going?" Nina forced a calm voice. "Bathroom." She guided Marco into a hallway, then into a restroom, and locked the door behind them. The fluorescent hum felt louder in the smaller space. Marco leaned over the sink, breathing hard, spit pink. "It wants the phrase," he whispered, not the sound. Nina stared at the tiled wall in front of her and felt the horrible truth settle into place. A name can be avoided. You can refuse to say someone's name, but a command lives in language itself. It lives in the places where humans use words to make things happen. And if the walls respond to it, then any building is a mouth. From outside the bathroom door, a calm voice spoke in Nina's tone, close enough to feel through the thin wood. "Say it." Marco squeezed his eyes shut and whispered, terrified, "If we say it here, it spreads." Nina stared at the sink drain and made the only decision that still felt like hers. They had to leave the only place people trust voices, public buildings. Because if a hospital could answer, then the next place would be worse. Airports, schools, churches, places built to carry sound. Nina unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out first, eyes down, keeping Marco close like she was escorting someone who might bolt. The hallway outside looked normal, fluorescent, beige, clean, but the hum felt louder now, like the building was listening through the wiring. At the end of the corridor, the waiting room had changed. People weren't sitting with bored faces anymore. They were standing, clustering, whispering. A nurse was arguing with a security guard. Someone was filming. A man near the vending machines had his hand pressed to the wall like he was checking if it was breathing. And behind all of it, a knock traveled through the building. One knock from the far wall, then another from closer, then 3 quick knocks from somewhere near the TV. The knocks weren't random. They were moving like a signal bouncing from surface to surface. Marco's shoulders rose. His throat worked. Nina tightened her grip on his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. Marco didn't answer, but Nina could feel the word trying to form in him like a sneeze. He was fighting his own mouth. The overhead intercom clicked again. This time, it didn't warn. It instructed. "Everyone remain calm," the voice said, and it used the same polite cadence hospitals use for drills. "Please refrain from speaking the command." A woman laughed nervously, like the announcement itself was absurd. A man scoffed. Someone said, "What command?" That question was poison. A kid near the chairs asked his mom to repeat what the intercom said. The mom looked irritated and began to repeat it out loud, and Nina felt her stomach drop because the trap wasn't in the forbidden word alone. It was in the human urge to repeat. Nina pulled Marco toward the exit without looking up, weaving through legs and shoes and dropped bags. The knocks followed, hopping closer, as if the building was tracking their movement through surfaces. At the glass lobby doors, a security guard stepped in front of them. "Ma'am, you can't," he began, then stopped mid-sentence like he'd heard something inside his skull. His eyes refocused too sharply. His mouth opened again, and Nina's own voice came out of him, flat and calm. "Say it before you leave." Nina's blood went cold. She didn't respond. She grabbed Marco's sleeve and pushed past, using her shoulder, not her voice. They burst outside into the night air under streetlights that felt too bright, too honest. Cars moved. People walked. The normal world was still functioning, and Nina hated how much she wanted to believe that meant safety. It didn't. Marco stopped at the curb, body stiff. His lips were moving without sound, practicing. Nina turned him to face her, but kept her gaze on his chest, not his eyes. "No speaking," she said. "Not a single word. Nod if you understand." Marco nodded fast. Nina pulled him to her car and shoved him inside. The moment the door shut, the interior light flicked on, and Nina felt her skin tighten because car interiors are small wall. Plastic and glass are still surfaces. Speakers are still mouths. She turned the key in the ignition, then stopped herself. Starting the car meant turning on systems she couldn't trust. Radio, Bluetooth, alerts, prompts, confirmation tone, too many channels. She started it anyway because standing still outside felt like being watched by every building on the block. The dashboard lit up. The radio clicked on by itself with no station. Static. Then a clear voice in Marco's tone, slightly flattened, spoke through the speaker. "Finish it." Nina slammed the radio off. The voice continued for half a second anyway, like it didn't need the knob, then cut out as if it had proven the point. They drove. Nina didn't pick a destination based on logic. She picked the only idea that felt like a defense. No walls. She got on the highway and headed toward the river bridge where the lanes widen and the shoulder is open, nothing but air on both sides. If the walls were the mouth, then open sky and water should be silence. She pulled onto the shoulder halfway across and killed the engine. The world outside was wind and distant traffic, nothing else. Nina opened her door and stepped out, then guided Marco out after her. They stood by the guardrail, open air on both sides, the river black beneath. For the first time all night, Nina felt a thin sliver of hope. Then Marco made a sound that wasn't a word, a choked exhale, like his body was trying to eject the syllables through breath alone. Nina grabbed his forearm. He shook his head, eyes squeezed shut, and mouthed silently, "I can't." Nina whispered, "You can. Don't give it the last piece." Marco pressed his forehead to the cold metal rail. His shoulders trembled. And in the open air, with no walls nearby, the older voice spoke anyway, close to Nina's ear, calm as a rule. "You brought your own walls." Nina froze. The voice continued, gentle, instructional. "Teeth, throat, chest, hollow spaces that carry sound. We don't need buildings." Nina felt her stomach drop, because she understood what that meant. If the command was designed to make walls answer, then a human body was the most intimate wall of all. Marco's jaw clenched. He swallowed hard, and Nina heard it. A faint knock deep in his chest, perfectly timed, as if something inside him was answering itself. One knock, a pause, then two. Nina backed away from him, horrified. Not because she was afraid of Marco, but because she could see the trap closing from the inside out. The older voice whispered, satisfied. "Now you understand why it's a command." Nina stared at the river and forced herself to make one decision with absolute clarity. They weren't going to outrun this by changing addresses. They were going to outrun it by breaking the loop it was building inside Marco's reflexes. And she had no idea yet how you stop a word from completing itself when it's already living in someone's mouth. Wind hit Nina's face and made her eyes water, but she didn't wipe it away. She kept her hands visible, open, because she couldn't shake the feeling that anything she did could become input. Marco stood with his forehead on the guardrail, trembling, swallowing hard like he was trying to keep a word from climbing up his throat. The knocks in his chest continued, faint but unmistakable. A response pattern, a system answering itself inside him. Nina's stomach tightened. "Marco, look at me," she said, then immediately regretted the word look. She corrected herself without saying the correction. She stepped into his peripheral space and lowered her own gaze to his shoes, not his face. "Breathe through your nose," she said. "Do not shape anything with your mouth." Marco nodded, but his lips moved anyway, tiny motions like a person practicing a sound silently. Nina could see the craving for completion in the way his tongue pressed against teeth, the way his jaw tensed. His body wanted to finish. That's when Nina realized the most terrifying possibility. What if the command isn't just a word? What if it's a shape the mouth makes? A pattern of muscle movement that can be triggered even without sound, like a sneeze, like a tick, like a reflex you can't willpower away once it's installed. Nina reached into her pocket for a pen and froze. Pens mean writing, and writing can become letters, and letters can become the command. She forced her hand away and instead did the only thing that wouldn't create symbols. She used touch. She pressed 2 fingers gently against Marco's jaw hinge, right below his ear, feeling the muscles clench and release. She applied pressure the way you'd apply pressure to stop someone from grinding their teeth. Not force, guidance. Marco's lips stopped moving for 1 second. Then his throat convulsed and he made a sound, not the command, but the beginning of it, a breathy shape that nearly became a syllable. Nina's heart slammed. "Bite," she whispered. "Bite your tongue again." Marco hesitated because pain is the last thing the body wants. But pain was the only thing that interrupted the loop. He bit down, hard. He jerked, tears spilling, and the breathy almost syllable died into a groan. The knocks in his chest stopped for a beat, like the system lost its timing. For 2 seconds, there was only wind and traffic. Then the older voice spoke again, close, calm, in Nina's tone. "Clever." Nina's skin went cold. She didn't answer. The voice continued like a teacher giving feedback. "You can delay. You can't delete." Marco whispered through blood. "It's not going away." Nina swallowed. "No talking. Only nod." Marco nodded, miserable. Nina stared at the river and tried to think of a solution that didn't involve language. No names, no writing, no repetition. She needed a way to interrupt the mouth pattern before it formed. Something mechanical. Her eyes landed on the guardrail, a long strip of cold metal. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a clean cloth from the car, and wrapped it around Marco's lower face like a makeshift muzzle, leaving his nose clear. Not tight enough to choke, tight enough to keep his lips from shaping sounds. Marco's eyes widened, offended for a second, then relieved, because relief is what happens when someone takes a decision away from you when your own body won't behave. The older voice laughed softly, using Nina's laugh, the one she does when she's nervous. "You're improvising," it said. "Good. That's still participation." Nina ignored it and guided Marco toward the car, keeping him moving because movement kept him from standing still with the word building up like pressure. They got in. Nina didn't turn on the radio. She didn't connect Bluetooth. She kept the dashboard dim. She drove with windows cracked for noise, for air, for anything that wasn't a wall answering back. She chose one destination on instinct, a place built not to carry voices, but to absorb them, a construction site. Raw concrete, open framing, unfinished surfaces that didn't resonate the way plaster and drywall do. She knew a site nearby where a new building was half-finished, fenced but accessible through a broken panel. They arrived before dawn when the city was still sleepy and the streets were quiet. Nina parked, cut the engine, and listened. No intercoms, no neighbors, no TVs, no thin walls with mouths. They climbed through the fence gap and stepped into the skeletal structure of the unfinished building. Wind moved through it. The place felt empty in a way that was almost comforting. Nina removed the cloth from Marco's face and watched him carefully. His lips didn't move. For the first time in hours, his throat looked calm. Nina exhaled. Then, from inside the bare concrete pillar beside her, a knock sounded. One clean knock, like a knuckle on stone. Nina's blood ran cold. The older voice whispered, satisfied, "Walls are optional." And then, from somewhere inside the unfinished structure, a chorus of whispers began to form the command with no single mouth speaking it, as if the word had learned how to exist as vibration alone. Marco's eyes went wide with terror and recognition. Nina grabbed his wrist and he mouthed through panic, "It's here." Nina understood then. It wasn't attached to the townhouse. It was attached to the moment the command was spoken. And if it could exist as vibration, then silence wouldn't save them. Only refusal would. Nina grabbed Marco's wrist and pulled him deeper into the unfinished building, away from the pillar that had just knocked like it had knuckles. The air inside was cold and hollow, wind whistling through exposed beams, and for 1 second she almost believed the open structure would make the sound die out. It didn't. The whispers didn't come from a corner. They came from everywhere at once, like the building itself had learned how to speak without a mouth, not loud, not a chant, a thin, layered vibration that kept trying to form the same shape over and over, as if it was practicing a word into existence. Marco's face went gray. His jaw started to move again, tiny, involuntary motions, like his mouth was trying to match what it heard even when he refused. Nina didn't say his name. She didn't say stop. She didn't say anything. She grabbed the cloth again and wrapped it over his mouth tighter this time, knotting it behind his head like a restraint. Marco's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, from relief. The relief of being physically prevented from becoming the channel. The whispers shifted, and the older voice returned, close as breath, using Nina's tone. "You think it needs lips." Nina's stomach dropped. She tightened the knot until Marco could only breathe through his nose. The whispering began to pulse, not in syllables, in a pattern. 3 short bursts, a pause, 3 short bursts. A knock pattern disguised as sound. Nina recognized it immediately because the building had already trained her to. It wasn't trying to make Marco say the command. It was trying to make his body keep time with it. Marco's shoulders started to twitch in rhythm, like a reflex. His chest hitched on the pauses. His throat tightened on the bursts. Nina watched it happening and felt sick because she could see the moment his body stopped being his and started being a metronome. She yanked him forward, moving fast now because standing still let the rhythm settle deeper. They passed stacks of drywall and insulation wrapped in plastic, past a ladder leaning against a concrete wall. Nina's eyes landed on a box of disposable foam earplugs sitting on a pallet. She ripped it open with shaking fingers and jammed earplugs into Marco's ears, then into her own. The world dulled. Wind turned into a low hush. The whispers should have disappeared. They didn't. They got clearer. Not louder. Clearer. Like the sound had moved inside their skulls where earplugs couldn't reach. Nina felt it in her teeth, the same way Camilla had felt ringing, except this wasn't ringing. This was language trying to become muscle. Marco squeezed his eyes shut and made a muffled sound under the cloth, panicked. Nina could tell he was still hearing it because his jaw kept trying to form something even with his mouth bound. She dragged him toward the stairwell of the unfinished building, toward the open concrete steps leading to the roof. She didn't want corners. She didn't want rooms. She wanted open air again. If the sound was using spaces, maybe height would thin it. They reached the roof. Dawn was still an hour away. The sky was ink. The city below was lights and distance. Wind hit them hard, clean, cold. For 2 seconds, Nina felt the pressure ease. Then the older voice spoke again, not from the building now, not from a wall, from inside the space between her thoughts. "You brought your own structure," it whispered. Nina's blood ran cold because she understood what it meant. The command didn't need drywall. It didn't need concrete. It could use the hollow spaces in a body the way it used vents and intercoms. Throat, chest, sinuses, teeth. Marco's chest began to knock. Not metaphorically, not anxiety. A real, soft, internal thump that made Nina step back in horror. One knock, then a pause, then two. Like something inside him was answering the pattern from the building. Marco grabbed Nina's sleeve with both hands, eyes wide, and shook his head violently as if he was begging her to stop it. He couldn't speak. The cloth held his mouth shut. The earplugs blocked the outside world, yet his body kept responding anyway. Nina looked around the roof and saw a small electrical box near the access door, the kind used to run temporary power. A thick cable ran down into the building. Nina's brain latched onto the simplest idea: noise. If the command existed as vibration, then maybe she could drown it in a messier vibration. She yanked open the box and found a portable work light still plugged in, the kind that has a loud mechanical switch. She flipped it on and off rapidly, trying to create a chaotic rhythm, anything that wasn't 3 bursts and a pause. The light did nothing for the dark, but the switch made a sharp click, 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 click. For a second, Marco's chest knocking stuttered. His shoulders loosened. The pattern lost its clean timing. Nina kept clicking, faster, desperate, turning it into a messy storm of sound. The older voice laughed softly, using Nina's laugh, the one she hated. "You're improvising," it said. "Good." Then it did something that made Nina's stomach drop. It synchronized. Marco's chest began knocking in time with Nina's frantic clicking, not fighting it, matching it, learning the new rhythm instantly, like it wasn't trying to complete a specific pattern anymore. It was trying to prove it could follow any pattern she gave it. Nina stopped clicking. The moment she stopped, the pattern snapped back to the clean 3 and pause. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. Marco doubled over like the rhythm had punched him from inside. His knees hit the rooftop gravel. Nina crouched beside him, hands shaking, and realized the brutal truth. She couldn't drown it out. She could only teach it more. Marco lifted his head and stared at her with wet, terrified eyes. The cloth over his mouth trembled as his lips moved beneath it, trying to shape the command anyway, even without sound, even with pain in his tongue. Nina pulled the cloth tighter and pressed her forehead to his, not to comfort him, to keep him anchored. She whispered without voicing words, only breath, because even language felt dangerous now. And in that breath, she felt it, her own throat trying to participate. A tiny muscle twitch, like the beginning of a syllable she hadn't chosen. Nina jerked back, horrified, and understood why the wall had wanted the command spoken in public. It didn't need one mouth. It needed a reflex that could install itself in many. Marco's phone buzzed in his pocket, a single vibration like a heartbeat. Nina didn't take it out. She didn't want screens. She didn't want letters. The older voice whispered, satisfied. "You don't need to say it," it said. "You just need to become the kind of body that would." Nina felt it in her own throat before she could admit it. A tiny twitch at the base of the tongue. A muscle preparing to shape something her mind hadn't approved. The same betrayal she'd watched in Marco, now starting in her body like a delayed infection. She clamped her teeth together and forced herself to breathe through her nose. Wind slapped her face on the rooftop, cold and clean. But the older voice stayed inside the space between her thoughts, calm as an instruction manual. "You hear it," it whispered. "That's enough." Nina tightened the cloth over Marco's mouth until his breathing turned loud and nasal. Then she wrapped a second cloth around her own lower face, not because she thought it would save her, but because she needed one less way to fail. They went down the stairs fast, hands on railings, eyes down, no speaking. The unfinished building creaked with wind, and every creak felt like a syllable trying to form. At street level, Nina shoved Marco into the car and started driving without choosing a destination. The instinct was simple: movement. If the command lived in rhythm, then maybe speed could smear it. Marco's chest knocked in the passenger seat, faint thumps under his ribs in that same pattern, as if something inside him was trying to keep time. He pressed both hands to his sternum like he could hold it still. Nina watched his hands instead of his face, and felt sick, because she could see the moment his fingers began to tap along with it without meaning to. The older voice returned, close as breath. "Don't fight the timing," it said. "Complete it." Nina didn't answer. She kept driving. They passed a pharmacy with the lights still on, open 24 hours, bright, clean. Nina hated the idea of going inside another building, but she needed something practical, something physical. If this was a mouth pattern now, she needed to interrupt the mouth, not argue with the walls. She pulled in hard and parked under the brightest canopy light she could find. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and plastic. A clerk looked up and opened his mouth to say hello. Nina's throat twitched again, a small preparatory movement, like her body wanted to reply to any greeting just to be normal. She didn't. She guided Marco down an aisle and grabbed the first things her hands found without thinking: sports tape, a mouth guard, numbing throat spray, a bottle of water, gauze pads, anything that could make a mouth less cooperative. At the register, the clerk looked at Marco's cloth-wrapped face and frowned. "You okay?" he asked. Nina held up a finger in a silent request for no conversation and set the items on the counter. The clerk nodded slowly, like he understood. Then his expression changed. Not fear, blankness. The same wrong focus Nina had seen in the hallway and the hospital, like a camera locking onto a subject. His mouth moved. Nina's voice came out. "Say it here." Nina went cold. She didn't look at his eyes. She stared at the counter edge and forced her hands to stay steady. Marco made a muffled, panicked sound under the cloth. His jaw started to work again. The clerk's lips moved late, like the voice was being played through him. "It's easier in public," Nina's voice said. "More walls." A customer at the next register turned, confused. "What did he say?" The clerk smiled politely, and Marco's flattened voice came out of him, calm and instructional. "Finish it." The customer laughed nervously because people laugh when they don't want to be afraid. He looked at Nina and said, "What's going on?" Nina felt her throat twitch harder, the first syllable trying to rise like a cough. She grabbed the bag, grabbed Marco's sleeve, and walked out fast. Behind them, multiple phones pinged at once. Not a coincidence. A chain reaction. A room full of devices getting the same notification, the same bait, the same silent invitation to repeat. They got to the car. Nina shoved Marco inside, tore the mouthguard package open with shaking hands, and pressed it into his mouth through the cloth like she was arming him against his own tongue. She sprayed the numbing throat spray into her own mouth without thinking twice, because thinking was how you died in this story. Her throat went cold and thick. For a moment, the twitching eased. Relief tried to bloom. Nina crushed it immediately. Relief was always the hook. Marco's chest knocked again, then stuttered like the rhythm had hit a speed bump. He gagged once under the cloth, then went still, eyes squeezed shut, breathing hard through his nose. Nina started the car. As she pulled out, she heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, a knock. One clean knock from somewhere inside the pharmacy wall. Then another, closer, as if the sound had jumped into the store next door. Then 3 quick knocks that came from inside the car door panel right beside Nina's knee. Nina's blood ran cold. The walls weren't answering because they were haunted. They were answering because the command had been primed, loaded into bodies, pushed into devices, and now the environment was echoing it like a network. Marco's eyes flew open. terrified, and for the first time all night, Nina saw the same realization in his face that she felt in her own bones. They weren't running from a building anymore. They were running from something that could make any space with surfaces behave like a mouth, and Nina could already feel the next twitch building in her throat, deeper this time, like the command was learning her shape. The knock inside the car door panel didn't sound like plastic. It sounded like knuckles on wood, like the townhouse had followed them into the highway without moving. Nina's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She forced her breathing slow, because if her throat tightened, the twitch would become a syllable. The numbing spray helped, but it also made her swallow differently, and the swallow felt like a rehearsal. Marco sat rigid with the mouthguard under the cloth, eyes wide, breathing hard through his nose. The knocking in his chest had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. It was waiting, like a rhythm that pauses to see if you'll finish it. Nina drove toward the only place she could imagine that wasn't a building and wasn't a crowd, an empty parking lot by a water treatment plant, a wide open space with chain-link fences and no public foot traffic, a place that felt ugly enough to be ignored by stories. She pulled in and killed the engine. The headlights washed the lot in harsh light. Concrete, fences, industrial silent. For one breath, the world behaved. Then the car's interior lights clicked on by themselves, bathing the cabin in a soft, too-human glow. Like the car was trying to make the space feel intimate. The older voice returned, not from a speaker, not from a phone, close to Nina's ear. "You're almost there," it said. Nina didn't answer. She stared at the dashboard numbers and kept her jaw locked. Marco's eyes rolled toward Nina, pleading. He couldn't speak. That was the point. But his body could still respond. The knock sounded again, this time from the roof of the car. 1, pause, 2. Nina's stomach dropped. It was the same response pattern they'd heard in walls. The environment wasn't random. It was participating. Marco's chest knocked once in response, faint under the mouthguard, like a call-and-response drill inside his ribs. Nina realized something that made her hands shake. The command didn't need to be spoken anymore. It had become a trigger that made surfaces answer and bodies keep time. Like a virus that no longer needs a full word, only the rhythm. Nina reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a roll of duct tape. She didn't want to do it. She had hated the idea of restraining Marco, hated how inhuman it felt. But she was past ethics that night. She was in survival math. She wrapped tape around the cloth over his mouth, sealing it tighter so air could still move through his nose, but his lips couldn't shift. Marco flinched, then nodded, eyes wet, because he understood the necessity. Then Nina taped her own mouth too. Not fully sealed, just a strip across the lips, enough to remind her body it couldn't complete anything without tearing it off. The tape pulled at skin when she swallowed, and the discomfort grounded her. Not relief, grounding. The older voice laughed softly, using Nina's laugh again, the one she does when she's cornered. "You're trying to make your body quiet," it said. "But bodies aren't the only walls." The car door knocked again from the inside. 3 quick knocks. Nina froze. She didn't even want to move her eyes. Marco's chest knocked once, then paused, then twice, matching the pattern like a metronome aligning. Nina's throat twitched hard behind the tape. She felt it. The attempt to shape the forbidden sound without lips, using throat alone. The tape didn't stop the muscle. It only made her feel it more clearly. Then something happened that turned the night from terrifying to procedural. Nina's phone, which she had kept face down and silent, lit up anyway. The screen showed no messages, no apps, just a blank white field. A cursor blinked, like a text box waiting for input. Then letters began to appear on their own, not the full command. Just the first syllable Marco had spoken earlier, then the next, building it, slowly, patiently, like the system was trying to complete the loop without needing a mouth at all. Nina stared at the screen and felt bile rise. The trap wasn't only in speech, it was in recognition. The moment she recognized the phrase, her brain would try to mouth it internally, and internal mouthing would become external twitching. Her throat convulsed behind the tape. Marco's eyes went wider, terrified, because he could hear it too, could feel it. The whole car had become a mouth. The older voice whispered, pleased. We can type, we can knock, we can echo. You don't get to keep it private." Nina's hand shook, and she realized the only remaining move was destructive, not corrective. If the command could live in any surface and any system, then the only way to stop it from completing itself was to remove the surfaces that carried it. Not forever, just long enough to break the loop. Nina grabbed Marco's wrist and guided him out of the car, tape and cloth and mouthguard and all, moving him into open air. She left the phone inside. She left the car lights on. She left the engine off. She stepped away from the car and stared at it under the lot lights like it was a contaminated object. Inside the car, the knocking continued. 1, pause, 2. 1, pause, 2. Like the vehicle was trying to speak through vibration. Nina walked to the trunk, pulled out the emergency road flare she kept for breakdowns, and lit it with shaking hands. The flare hissed to life, red and violent, throwing hard shadows onto the concrete. The older voice went quiet for the first time, as if the sudden chaotic light had interrupted its clean pattern. Nina looked at the car and understood what she was about to do. She wasn't going to fix anything. She was going to burn the channel. Nina held the flare at arm's length, like it was a weapon and a mistake at the same time. Red light spilled across the parking lot, harsh and alive, throwing shadows so sharp they looked cut out of paper. The car sat a few feet away, interior lights still on, phone still glowing inside with that blinking cursor like a mouth waiting to be fed. From the car roof, knock, pause, knock, knock. Marco flinched on instinct, shoulders jerking in rhythm. The tape across his lips strained as his jaw tried to move beneath it. Nina forced herself not to look at his face. She focused on his hands, his elbows, the parts of him that were still human. Then she stepped toward the car. The older voice returned immediately, close as breath, not from the car speakers, not from a phone, from the air itself, as if the space around her had learned language. "Don't," it said in Nina's tone. "You'll spread it." Nina stopped. Spread it. Of course it would say that. The system always used the cleanest lever, fear of causing harm. She tightened her grip on the flare until her wrist ached. The voice softened, almost kind. "You want it to end?" it whispered. "Then finish it correctly." Nina didn't answer. She moved again, faster this time, because hesitation was where it lived. She jammed the flare through the open driver's side window and dropped it onto the seat. The flare hissed louder, spitting bright red sparks into the upholstery. Smoke curled instantly, thick and chemical. The car interior filled with violent red light that made every surface look like a throat. For one breath, the knocking stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like a system losing power. Then the car horn blared once, not a stuck alarm, a single clean blast like a punctuation mark. Marco jumped. His chest knocked once in reply, a faint internal thump that made Nina's stomach turn. Nina yanked him backward by the sleeve, away from the car, away from the smoke. The older voice didn't sound angry. It sounded curious. "Destruction is still input," it said. "We learn faster when you panic." The car interior began to burn properly now, not a flame ball, a contained, hungry fire licking along the seat fabric. The flare's red light mixed with orange flame, and the shadows around the parking lot started to behave wrong. They stretched toward the car, then away from it, as if light sources had stopped obeying physics. Marco made a muffled sound under the tape, body trembling. His eyes were fixed on the burning car like his nervous system wanted to memorize it. Nina grabbed his shoulders and forced him to look down at the concrete. No more looking for patterns, no more feeding it attention. The moment she did, the ground answered. A knock from the concrete under Nina's shoe. Not a sound traveling through air. A vibration that felt like the ground itself had a knuckle and a sense of humor. Knock. Nina's throat twitched behind the tape. She felt the impulse to gasp, to say something, to react. She didn't. The older voice whispered, satisfied. "Good. Now you understand." The burning car popped, a small explosion as something inside it gave way. The phone inside the cabin flashed bright white once, like a camera flash, then went dark. For a second, the entire lot was lit in a clean, unnatural way. And in that single bright frame, Nina saw it. Not a monster, not a face. A shape in the shadow cast by the car, standing where no body stood, too tall and too thin, shoulders angled like it was listening. Its edges were sharp in a way shadows shouldn't be sharp, and its head was turned slightly toward Nina, not toward her eyes, toward her mouth. The light returned to normal firelight and streetlight. The shape vanished. Marco made a desperate, muffled sound, shaking his head violently like he was begging Nina to leave, to run, to do anything but stand here while the system watched. Nina grabbed him and started moving fast across the lot toward the chain-link fence, toward the road, toward anywhere else. The older voice spoke again, calm, and this time it used Marco's voice, flattened, clean. You can't burn a word. Nina's blood went cold because it wasn't wrong. The car was burning, but the impulse in her throat was still there. The twitch, the need to complete, the craving for a loop to close. As they reached the fence line, a security light on a pole clicked on automatically, washing them in bright white. Nina flinched because bright light makes sharp shadows, and sharp shadows were where it could step. A man in a reflective vest appeared near a gate, walking toward them with a flashlight. A security guard, or a night worker drawn by smoke. "Hey," he called. "You can't—" His voice cut off mid-sentence. His head tilted slightly like someone had whispered into his ear. His eyes unfocused, then snapped into that wrong camera-lock stare. His mouth moved. Nina's voice came out of him, gentle and familiar. "Say it." Nina didn't answer. She didn't even look at his face. She grabbed Marco's arm and pulled him toward the gate anyway. The guard reached out, not to stop them, to guide them like he was helping. Marco's chest knocked again in that pattern, and Nina felt her own throat answer with a twitch. The older voice whispered, so close it felt like it was inside her teeth. "2 mouths now," it said. "1 more and the walls will answer everywhere you go." Nina shoved the gate open and dragged Marco through. Behind them, the guard's flashlight fell to the ground with a clatter, and the sound echoed like a knock in a hollow space. Knock. Nina didn't look back. She just ran, tape on her mouth, breath burning in her nose, the taste of numbing spray and fear in the back of her throat, knowing the worst truth of the night wasn't the burning car. It was the fact that the command didn't need a building anymore. It had started building itself inside them. Nina ran until her lungs burned and her legs turned heavy, dragging Marco by the sleeve because stopping felt like giving the system time to settle. The tape across her mouth tugged at skin with every breath, a constant reminder not to form anything that could become a syllable. They reached a highway underpass where the city noise was loud and constant, where car tires on asphalt created a messy, irregular roar. Nina ducked them under the concrete span, away from streetlights, away from clean shadows, and finally stopped. Marco collapsed against a pillar, knees bent, head down. He was shaking so hard the cloth over his mouth fluttered. Nina crouched beside him and forced herself to do the only thing that wasn't a correction. Stillness. No more running, no more new inputs, no more teaching it new reactions. Her throat twitched once, deep, like the command was still trying to find the path out. She pressed 2 fingers gently to the base of her tongue through her jawline, feeling the muscle strain, the involuntary urge to complete. Marco's chest knocked once, then paused, then knocked twice. Nina felt her own throat answer with a tiny reflexive pulse, like a sympathetic vibration. That's when she understood what the night had really been. Not a haunting, not a curse, conditioning. The command wasn't powerful because it was mystical. It was powerful because it exploited the most basic human reflex. Hear a prompt, complete it. Hear a name, repeat it. Hear a rule, test it. The system didn't need to possess walls. It needed to hijack the loop that makes language feel inevitable. Nina reached up slowly and peeled the tape off her mouth. It stung. She didn't speak. She didn't even swallow loudly. She just let her lips sit in neutral shape, refusing to form anything. She removed Marco's tape and cloth carefully, keeping his mouthguard in place. He was breathing hard, eyes wet, looking at Nina like she was the only anchor left in a world where mouths had become doors. He tried to speak. Nina raised a finger and shook her head once. Marco nodded, exhausted, then lifted his hand and pointed to his throat, then to Nina's, then made a small circular motion with his finger, like a loop. Nina nodded back. Yes, the loop. She pulled out her phone for the first time in an hour and immediately regretted it. The screen was black, but it felt heavy in her hand, like a loaded object. She didn't open messages. She didn't check notifications. She opened the Notes app and typed 3 words, then showed Marco. No repeating, ever. Marco nodded fast. Then a new line appeared beneath Nina's text without her typing. A blinking cursor, a pause, and the first letter of the command appeared. Nina slammed the phone screen off and shoved it into her bag like it could bite. She stared at the concrete ground and forced herself to breathe through her nose. The older voice did not whisper this time. It didn't need to. The city around them answered with a single knock from somewhere inside the underpass structure, deep and hollow. Knock. Marco flinched. Nina didn't. She felt the twitch in her throat surge, the impulse to complete the loop by speaking, by naming, by answering. She didn't. She sat there in the dirty noise of traffic and made the final choice of the case. She would live with incomplete language, no closure, no perfect explanation, no clean ending you can repeat to someone else, because repeating was the doorway. Later, Nina would move out without telling anyone why. Marco would transfer buildings. Mrs. Klein would stop sleeping. The hospital would file the intercom incident as a system malfunction. The gas station clerk would remember nothing but a strange night and smoke in the air, and the command would keep existing the way it always existed, not as a ghost in a wall, as a temptation in the throat, waiting for the moment someone says, "What was the name?" and you make the mistake of answering. The last and only useful rule in the entire file isn't mystical, it's practical. If a house answers from inside the walls, it's not listening for your fear. It's listening for your mouth to complete what it started, and the moment you do, you become the wall that answers next.